My name is Will Gibbons. I'm the Global Training Specialist at KeyShot. And today what we're going to be doing is picking up on a previous series of webinar that we started a while ago called the Efficient KeyShot User. And so again, we're talking about more or less the best way to go about building your scenes. And this one is going to focus on speed. One of our previous webinars within the series was all about materials. So how do we handle materials in an efficient manner? Well, this one is all about working in KeyShot quickly. And the whole reason you should care about efficiency is because the less time you spend trying to figure things out or making edits or things like that, the less time you have to make awesome rendering. So we're hoping to show you the quickest way around KeyShot and how to get your ideal images out of KeyShot as fast as possible. So whether you're a beginner and you're just looking to speed up your workflow a little bit, or maybe you're a veteran and you've got a lot of hands-on KeyShot experience and you're hoping to just really dial in your technique so you can pump out more imagery, this is going to be for everybody. Excellent. Okay. So before we start this, I want to mention that this is being recorded and this will be available on YouTube in a few days. So if you can't make the whole thing, no big deal. The computer that we're working on today, this is a 3 gigahertz, 8 core, 16 thread, 2013 MacBook Pro, Mac Pro, and it's got 16 gigabytes of RAM. So this is not by any means a crazy machine. This is a fairly typical machine that a creator might have. Now, if you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to type those into the chat box and ask a question. It looks like you guys have already found your way to the questions, so feel free to ask more throughout the process. And somebody from Luxion should be able to help you out. I believe we have Rex and Josh on the line as well today. And one final note before diving into the meat of this presentation and demo today is that this is going to be a little bit different than some of our previous webinars in that there's a ton of tips and tricks here. And instead of going deep into how to use one specific tool or get one specific outcome within KeyShot, today we're going to be looking all over for all those little shortcuts we can do to move us through the program faster. And then, so as far as our topics go, we're going to begin with importing data because that's how every KeyShot session starts. You got to get your models into KeyShot before you can do anything with them. And then we're going to look at, how we do that, the best ways. We're going to then take a look at our interface and see how we can adjust that to suit our needs and again, set us up for speed. Then we're going to look at organizing and moving our models. So basically composing your scene within KeyShot. We'll take a look at some of the best and most often used hotkeys that we have. Of course, we've got to talk about materials. So some shortcuts and some efficiencies there. And then we'll take a look at cameras and then also some things you can do to speed up the process when it comes to animation. And we will finish just like we always do with the Q&A. So if we've got some minutes at the end of the presentation for you guys to ask questions, then we will address those questions. So without further ado, we're going to dive right in here. So on the topic of importing data, actually the first tip that I have here actually begins before you even open KeyShot, believe it or not. This first thing, mouse sensitivity, is an interesting one because if you're picking up your mouse 2 or 3 times to move it from left of the screen to the right of the screen and vice versa, you're wasting time. So this whole presentation is going to be focused on all these, again, teeny little things that add up to make you a much faster KeyShot user. So let's make sure that your mouse's sensitivity in your operating system is turned up high enough that you can move from left to right across the screen without picking up your mouse. That's step number 1. The next one we have here is launching KeyShot quickly. So you may be one of those people like myself who keeps a fairly clean dock with no major applications down here. If you want to launch KeyShot quickly on a Mac, it's going to be command space, start typing, and then hit enter, and then KeyShot will launch as it did in the background here. And if you are on a Windows machine, you can hit Windows, search for your application and then just hit enter. So that's one nice little tip we have there. All right. Next we have importing geometry. Okay, so there are a number of ways you can get your geometry into KeyShot, and we could always go up to our regular toolbar, search for a file and import. But there's actually a faster way, and not many people realize that you can actually just drag a file into the KeyShot user interface. So I have a folder off screen that I just grabbed a file, a SolidWorks assembly, and dragged it into the KeyShot user interface. And now we can open that file. So we don't need to go browsing for files using the file open or import dialog if we don't want to. I'm going to go ahead and make a couple quick changes since this is a totally fresh KeyShot installation. And the next thing, while that's importing, we'll take a look at is adding other geometry to the scene. So this would include primitives as well as some custom geometry, and we'll talk about what that means here in just a moment. So if I switch on over to KeyShot, here we've got our KeyShot window, and I've got a camera that was imported just by dragging and dropping it in. Also, I will mention I imported native CAD data. This is a SolidWorks file. This is not something like a STEP or an IGES or an OBJ, which might be considered an Exchange format. So I will recommend that you guys always use your native CAD data if you can when you drag that into KeyShot, and that will usually give you some pretty nice import results. All right, so as far as adding other geometry as mentioned, we can always go to File, Edit, Add Geometry, and then we have a lot of items listed here that we can add with the keyboard shortcut, Control or Command, depending on if you're Mac or PC, and then the number keys across the top. And if I hit this button for a cylinder, we see a little cylinder shows up underneath our camera. And then, of course, if we needed to, we could move this around or scale it, do what we need with it. Now, I will mention this cylinder came into our KeyShot scene roughly 1/10 the size of our largest piece of geometry, which is our camera model at this point. So when you add a piece of geometry like one of these primitives, it's going to come into KeyShot, again, 1/10 the size of the largest piece of geometry already in here. So keep that in mind. Now, the other thing that I'll mention, or the other way to add this geometry is, again, the keyboard shortcut. If I hit Command 1, it'll add, again, another piece of geometry with the Move tool already active, and I can place that where I need to. So if you're using primitives like this for physical lights, this is a nice hotkey to remember. Is Control 1 is going to give you a cube, and then you can just throw any light material you want onto it, and then you're off to the races. The other thing I will mention is that if you had primitives of your own, because say you do this quite often and you need a slightly different shape, you can go into your KeyShot directory and actually use some of your own models as well. And in just to show an example of this, let's see, if I hit Command 6, I believe I had it here, you can see my my geometry that gets added. We'll take this out of performance mode real quick. And it's rotated, but you can see here, I have this large backdrop with a podium on it. So right here, we've got, throw this back in performance mode so we can see. But basically, we've got a couple of boxes stacked on top of this large backdrop. Now, of course, my environment is much too small for this scene right here. If we go ahead and throw in a different environment that is scaled properly for this piece of geometry, this backdrop plane, we can see now that we have some basic geometry. So this is just one example. Again, if you need the object that is being placed in your KeyShot scene using the add geometry feature. If you need the pieces that are being added to your scene to be a very specific size, then I would recommend that you not go about adding geometry that way, because when you use that, again, as shown, sometimes these will come in really small. And then in the example of my backdrop, it came in very large. If we were to look at the size of it, go to the position tab, we can see it came in as a scale of 9. If I go back to 1 and hit enter, we can see now that this is probably the size that I had modeled it and intended this to be to begin with. But again, if you need this to be a very specific or particular size, I would import your geometry like you would any other model. The edit add geometry is usually used for simple things like little primitives like these items that you might use to apply like a light material to or something like that. So anyway, the next thing that we have on deck here is, oh, well, the one thing I will show you real quick is what you would do to add a custom piece of geometry, just in case you're interested. So if I was to look at my KeyShot directory here, the KeyShot 7 folder that has things like materials and environments and stuff, if I were to go in here and look at models folder, you can see these are the models that get placed into your KeyShot scene when you hit one of those hotkeys. So in this case, that one that I imported was called Podium Backdrop, and it's a .bip file. So it's actually a KeyShot file here. And it was, you know, depending on how far down this list it is, it will be automatically assigned a hotkey from command 1 to command 0, I believe. But yeah, just wanted to show you that that's a possibility if you find yourself using a same simple geometry from time and time again. You can save yourself some time doing that. All right, the next thing is opening a new BIP file in KeyShot without actually closing the KeyShot dialog. So we get asked this all the time. And the question is, you know, how do I get a new file open and imported into KeyShot without actually closing KeyShot? Well, it's just a matter of actually dragging a new BIP file into your scene. So if I wanted to open up a camera that I have here that I'm going to be using, I've got this BIP file that I just dragged into my KeyShot real-time view. And when I let go, we get the option to open or import. So if I want to open, I will leave this on the default and I hit open, and it will close the scene that's currently open, and then it will show me the scene that I just dragged in here. So if we want to open up a different file, all we do is drag a new BIP file into the real-time view and then hit OK, and it will close the one that was currently open, and then it opens up the new one. So that's how you would open a KeyShot file without closing first, then relaunching KeyShot. All right, let's move on here. So the next thing that we have here is our KeyShot interface. So one thing that we did with KeyShot 7 that's pretty neat is we allowed you to customize your KeyShot user interface the way you want it. So the first thing is to take advantage of workspaces. So again, I will open up our KeyShot user interface and go ahead and open up the KeyShot 7 that we want to see. Alrighty. And the nice thing about workspaces is that we can go ahead and change them to aid us in our workflow. So using this drop-down menu, we've got our workspaces. We've got the default workspace, which is the one that we are all probably used to, with our materials on the left, our project panel on the right. But one thing that we can do, of course, is to disable some of the items within our workspace to reduce clutter. So if the numerous buttons up here are distracting, we could do a number of items like turn off text, or in many cases, if we're using, say, a 3-button mouse, which I am right now, I could turn off things like dolly, pan, tumble. If I know the hotkey for move, maybe I don't want the move tool. And I could basically continue down this list, turning off items that maybe I don't use quite as frequently. And in this case, maybe by doing this, I now have fewer buttons, and if I want to look up to locate something, it will just generally take me less time to locate the button I'm looking for if I have fewer buttons to look through. So that's just one, again, small thing, but may make a difference, especially for you guys who are just newer to KeyShot, maybe just learning things, figuring things out. So another thing is taking advantage of display real estate. So what that means is if I'm on a large monitor, which I am right now, I'm not using a laptop or anything, I could go ahead and use one of these workspaces, say animation, which takes advantage of a large monitor. So I don't necessarily need much workspace here in the real-time view. I can, maybe it's more important that I have all of my controls for my scene on the left. I've got my geometry view on the right. I've got my timeline across the bottom. Things like this will again allow you to have access or have easy access to all the tools that you need on short notice if your monitor is set up for it. Same thing if you have multiple displays, you can take advantage of those as well. Because the fewer times that you're opening and closing windows and moving things around, again, it'll help you move through the program a lot faster. So another one is taking your workspace with you, and by this I mean if you didn't know this already, when we go to manage a workspace, you can actually export your workspaces as well. So let's say you're moving between a couple of computers, maybe you've gotten used to your computer at home or at work and vice versa, and you want to take your KeyShot experience with you. Maybe you're traveling, for whatever reason, you're on a new machine. If you've gotten used to a certain workspace, you might as well take that workspace with you, install that on the new machine, and again, you've got, at that point, you'll have your comfortable custom workspace that you've grown accustomed to. So just want to make sure you guys know that those features are in there. Now, the next thing I want to mention is in preferences. So we can do a couple of things inside our KeyShot preferences. First off, if we go through the general tab here, there is a welcome screen, a welcome window that starts up every time. Now, I don't recommend disabling this because if you want to see the latest KeyShot news, the latest webinars, videos, all that stuff, you're going to see that published to the welcome window. However, if you are somebody who does not want that to pop up every time, you can save yourself a click from hiding it by turning this off if you want. The other thing I wanted to mention is this one right here, save camera with each screenshot. Now, if you already use this function as part of your workflow, then don't worry about it. But if you're somebody who does not want a camera to be saved with every single screenshot you take within KeyShot, you can turn this off, and that way, every time you hit the screenshot button in the bottom right-hand corner of your KeyShot user interface, you're not going to get an extra camera added to your scene. If you did not want that to happen, you could find yourself spending a lot of time deleting unwanted cameras. So you can turn that off right here. And another thing that we have here is CPU selection outline. So what does that mean? If I was looking here in my interface, we see something here called Use CPU for Selection Outlines. So KeyShot, if you have very large assemblies and every time you click on something, it takes a long time to draw the orange selection outline, you might find that your computer is being taxed by the size of the model you're working with. Sometimes it can be faster if you use CPU for selection outlines when you run into that issue. So I'm not saying necessarily turn it on by default, but if you do run into the situation where you're waiting a couple seconds for a KeyShot to draw the orange outlines and that bothers you, you can try the CPU and there's a good chance it will be a little bit faster. And of course, there's one other thing here I want to call out, that's submenus. So enabling submenus in the real-time view, I'll show you what this looks like. If I check this box, I'll hit Save Changes. And when I right-click now, we don't see anything because I don't have any geometry in here to work with. So if I go ahead and add a cube, as we already showed how to do, if I were to right-click on this cube, we see now that I've got submenus in my right-click menu. So Material houses all the different material options. Move will house the move options, visibility, lock, navigation, etc. So we've got a lot of different options here as far as, well, the same tools that you normally have access to, but instead of one big long menu here, they're kind of organized and there's submenus. So if this is something faster to you to find what you're looking for, you might want to enable submenus. All right, now I think for the rest of our presentation, we're going to be working with an actual model here. So let me go ahead and import one more time that camera, and I'll show you some cool things that we can do to speed that process along. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and change this to my default workspace. And I'm going to then find my training camera. We'll pull this guy into KeyShot. And we see, let's make sure I've got my correct import options. Okay, so I'll hit import. Okay, so what we want to start with here is talking about using model sets. Model sets is something that's part of Studios in KeyShot 7, and they allow us to do a lot of neat things. First thing I want to show you, other than that model sets exist, is you're not always going to get as lucky as I did here and have a full-on CAD assembly that's been modeled correctly, that has well-named and labeled sub-assemblies and assemblies, etc. Sometimes we get less than ideal models, and they might not have, well, they might just have a flat hierarchy. So they don't have this kind of parent-child relationship. It's just basically a big list of parts and surfaces, and that can be very tedious to work with. So one way we could potentially work with data like that is to create model sets to reorganize and regroup some of our model. So for example here, I've got a lens right here. If I wanted this lens to be on its own, we're going to use our imaginations and pretend that all the parts here for this lens are not kept in one nice little subassembly. Imagine it's just tons and tons of parts here. What I would do is I would multi-select all the parts that make up that lens subassembly, and I would add it to a model set. But the fast way to do this that most people don't know is if you right-click on the items in your scene tree, you can say create model set from selection. So if you've been selecting a bunch of parts, whether it's in the real-time view or in the scene tree, you right-click on the highlighted items in the scene tree, and then you can go ahead and make your model set, and I'll call this one lens only. And if I want those materials to be linked, I can. But notice it's already selected them from what could be a very long list of parts if we're dealing with one of those flat assembly structures like I mentioned. And if I hit OK, we're automatically in our lens only subassembly, and I can just, there's another trick too. I can click, drag up, multi-select those two model sets, right-click, render thumbnails, and we can see that there's now a thumbnail that shows each one of those model sets here. So you can imagine if we have, let's say, a set of headphones, and you want maybe the left ear cup to be in one model set, the right ear cup to be in another model set, maybe the headband in another model set. You could start to regroup your assembly so it can be more easily animated. Another example might be, say, a car door. If you want your car door to be able to open and close in one animation, or open around a single pivot, but the various components that make up that car door are scattered throughout a very big assembly, you can reorganize them into model sets to help you accomplish this, because then that whole model set, the way that is laid out is it's now its own model, as the name would imply, and then you can animate this as a whole, which would be really nice. So that's some of the clever ways that you can use model sets other than just managing, like, say, different versions of the same model or geometry. Another interesting thing is you can isolate a model from a ground plane or physical lights this way. So if we had, let's go ahead and say that I'll go to my default here, and I'll add a ground plane using a sneaky keyboard shortcut. I'll show you guys in a little bit. If I go ahead and change that into, say, just a diffuse material, So we have our ground plane. I'll go ahead and throw a different environment in here too, just to make it a little easier to read. And let's go ahead and add a cube really quickly to make a physical light. I'll find a light material. So you can see very quickly we've already composed our scene in just a few seconds using some of the shortcuts that we've already showed you. But now let's say you want your model to be totally separate from these other objects that add context to your scene. We could also go ahead and place the ground plane and the cube in their own model set. And there we go, we have them off on their own. And then if we didn't want them in this default model set, of course, I could just remove these here by deleting them. And again, if we want to manipulate the model without being affected by, say, the lights and the ground plane, we could, there's a couple things that we'll talk about where this will come in handy here in the future. The other thing is to reorganize and regroup your assembly. So this was already touched on, so I'm going to just kind of breeze over this. But basically, once again, we know that our default assembly came in looking nice with all sorts of sub-assemblies and parts and stuff. But again, if you didn't have such a nicely organized model, you could start creating model sets to reorganize and build out your different various kind of sub-components if you need to. All right, so selection and move tool. This is a big one here. So we move things in KeyShot a lot. What if we want to move things around? Yes, we can always right-click, select a part, right-click on it, find the move button, and then say move part, model, or selection. But we do have a faster way to do it in KeyShot 7, which is awesome. If we hover over a part, and all I do is hit Control or Command D, as in Delta, that part is automatically selected, and the move tool pops up. So that part was underneath my cursor. That's how it selected this individual part. And now we can see that I could just, grab one of these and move it around as I needed to. The other way we could select parts here, if we needed to select a number of parts, and instead of combing through this big, long assembly structure that we have here on the right, maybe I just want to be able to select a bunch of smaller components like these little screws. I could hold Shift and left click and drag a box around a bunch or part of my model. And you'll notice the only items that became selected were a bunch of these screws. The reason that worked was because I drew a box to do box selection, and box selection only works and only draws outlines around the items that were 100% enclosed within that box. So this is super, super helpful. And again, if I needed to, I could right click, make another model set from these, or maybe copy them to an existing model set. But I could do this and I can start very quickly breaking out parts of my assembly. The other way we can use box selection to our advantage is if we go the opposite direction. If I hold Shift and click with my left mouse button and drag from the right to the left, anything I drag through will be selected. So notice here, an entirely different selection of parts. In fact, almost everything got selected because I dragged a box that went through most of the components on this camera. So that's pretty neat. So just to reiterate one more time, box selection is Shift, left click, drag. From left to right is going to select everything that's totally enclosed within the box, whereas Shift, left click from the right to the left will select everything you draw through or intersect. All right, and then so our hotkey was the one I mentioned, Control D. So if something is already selected, as I just did with that box selection, I could hit Command or Control D and move those parts. Very nice. And then let's talk about quickly pivots and our axes. So sometimes you want to move one part around another part, or perhaps in relation to another part. Well, that's, let's say I want this red button to rotate around the center of this lens. Well, using our newfound hotkeys, I'll go ahead and I'll I'll hover over that button, hit Control D, and it is selected. And now we have our little Move Tool dialog box. We see that the pivot says self. That means that this button is going to pivot around the center of itself. Instead, what I want to do is pick a different pivot. So I'll click Pick, and I can see the part I want to pivot around. So I'll just click it in the real-time view. We see a little black dot in the center of it, so I'll hit OK. And now the pivot is the lens glass, and our Move Tool moves to that pivot. So now if we move our Move Tool, say rotate or something, our button is now moving relative to the center of this pivot that we clicked, which is nice. But what if I actually want this button to be in the middle of this piece of glass? All I have to do is say snap to pivot, because our pivot has already been set. Now I'm snapping the button that is currently active to the pivot, and there we go. So you can move parts and line them up very quickly by doing this, which can be very helpful. Like let's say I want to take one of these little screws, move it, select the pivot, I'll pick that button, okay, I'll snap to pivot, and now we've got a screw and our button. There we go, grab the button, pull that out, and then the lens. And so I can, pretend I made a neat little exploded view here. So lots of stuff we can do with the Move tool that sometimes gets overlooked. And something else I want to call out is this geometry view. So let's say we're working with specific lighting. We want to keep our render camera right where it's at so we can see into our scene. But what if we want to be able to view our scene from another angle at the same time? What I can do, I'll go ahead and close my library panel, and I'm going to go to Window and choose Geometry View. And you'll see the O. That means the hotkey O will bring up our geometry view. And if I scroll out, we can see our geometry view is a nice OpenGL shaded, very simple, very simple workspace, I suppose. And if we wanted to then say, so let's go ahead and move my camera down here, and let's say I'm going to go ahead and actually quickly add a cube to my scene, and I'll move it off out of the camera's view site. And if I were to make this a light material, and then let's say my camera is somewhere down here, but I want to move that light, well, I can use the geometry view as I have here to then move this part, and now I can move my light in real time while still working and keeping an eye on my final composition, which can really save us a lot of time instead of going back and forth, adjusting the light, then adjusting your view, and vice versa. It's a much faster way to work. So that's the geometry view. Again, hotkey O will bring that up. Unless you're typing in one of those boxes, then it won't. So there we go. That's our geometry view. All right. The other thing real quickly is scene tree selection. This one's fairly obvious, but if you do have a big assembly and you're looking for specific parts, so we have a lot of parts here, but let's say I don't know where things are, I can search for the word aperture. There we go. And before I even finish the word, I have found and identified these aperture blades, which are hidden inside my display, or sorry, my camera here. So I can't actually see them, but I can select them using the scene tree easily. And then of course I can move them around or whatever. The other thing I can do is use a filter. So show and filter by lights is another way that I can filter out my parts. So right now we see nothing because I still have the APE keywords, key letters as a search. So I delete those. Now we can see our cube that's in our scene, and I could easily select that and make an adjustment. So even in the case here where maybe I'm not using the geometry view, but I want to adjust my light, I can filter out in the scene tree and then type in some bigger values and see how that looks. All right, what else do we have here? So hotkeys. Hotkeys are a good one. This one won't take really long. So The nice thing here about hotkeys is we not only give you hotkeys in KeyShot 7, but we give you the ability to change and customize these to meet your needs. So right now, these are the ones that I find myself using all the time when I'm working. We've got move, which we've already talked about, which is Command or Control D. We have rotate environment, which is a great one. So I'll show you what this looks like. If we went ahead and I'll go ahead and show my environment. Right now it's all white. If we go to my environment tab and I switch to my light environment so we can see it. If I wanted to, I can rotate that environment by holding Control and left click dragging. This will rotate the environment in the real-time view. So if I were to turn off my cube light and I rotated my environment, it will shine different light and affect the reflections and highlights on my camera here. So being able to, again, rotate your environment without going over the tab, the environment tab and scrolling, this is just something I do constantly as I'm working in KeyShot to try to adjust my lighting. Another good one is hide part, which is going to be Control Alt left click, otherwise on a Mac, Command Option left click. So if I want to start hiding parts here just by clicking on them, I can hold those two keys, Control Alt and then left click, and the part will disappear on anything I click on. And this is a nice way to drill down into an assembly of parts. And then of course we can always right click and bring those back. But again, that was Control Alt left click to hide those. Another one that we have here is copy and paste material. So this is a pretty simple one here, but if you've never known this, this is going to be a big deal. So if I search for a plastic and I want this green plastic here, let's say I want to copy it from one part to another super quickly. I hold Shift and I left click it, and that copies it onto the clipboard. And then while holding Shift, I right click and that will paste it, and it links them together. So if we look at our in-scene materials, we only have one green plastic material right here, and that's the one that we just pasted. So if I paste this on a bunch of parts while holding, so Shift right click, it's on 3 or 4 parts, but we still have that one green plastic, which means if we were to make an edit, it will change the color of all of those together because they were linked. Another one that you saw me do earlier is add ground plane. So let's talk about this one. Sometimes we need a ground plane because we want to throw some textures on the ground or control the way light reflects off the ground or anything like that. So we can do Control or Command G to add a ground plane, and all of a sudden this changes the look of my scene because we have a light overhead, we've got some shadows and stuff like that. And of course I could go into this ground plane, change the ground materials, do all sorts of fun stuff with this, add some roughness. So what else do we have here? We've got 2 others here. I think these are some ones that most people don't know, is free camera and real-time region render. So let's say I'm going to render out my final image like this. So this is my final image. I'm going to make a camera called render, and I'm going to lock it really quickly. Now let's say I'm in my scene tree or my environment maybe, and I want to adjust my camera. Well, I can't. But if I hold Control Shift and F, I can switch quickly to the free camera, which is super cool because now I can make my adjustments and then just switch back. So if you ever find yourself working here, now you need to adjust something, but you click and drag and you can't do it, all you need to do is Control Shift F, and now you switch to the free camera. And along a similar lines, we have the real-time region render, which would be Control Shift R. So if you ever are using region render to check out how a material looks or get KeyShot to render faster in a small region, you can just hit Control Shift F or R or Command Shift R to bring up or hide that region render instead of going to the image tab and turning on region. It's just a lot faster. Cool. So we've got those guys. Those are some of the most popular hotkeys, the ones that I think really speed up your workflow if you can remember those. And again, this presentation will be downloaded. You guys can download it later. So if you don't have time to memorize those hotkeys now, you can later. Some materials. So let's talk about this real quick. And of course, I have been using a pretty lame looking camera with some pretty lame looking materials on it so far. We're about to change that. So let's go ahead and check out how cool material templates are. So let's pretend I've been working on this camera for a few weeks and I made a change to the model, and now I want to quickly reapply all the materials I spent so long building. Well, we're going to do that. So if I go ahead and relaunch KeyShot, so I've got a new KeyShot session. What we'll do is we will import that camera, but we're going to have all the materials that we spent a long time working on applied automatically. So you might have noticed this earlier when I imported this model. I have this third checkbox under materials and structure. What this is going to allow us to do is use a material template. When I check that, it'll apply the material template called black camera. But you can also apply it after the fact. So I'll let it import on its own with no materials. And then I'll apply that in our scene so we can see the difference. So you guys know I didn't just open up a file that already had all the right materials on it. So what KeyShot's going to do is look for the colors on this camera. So if we look here, the materials, they're different colors here. They're all just diffuse materials. If I want, I can go to my window, grab my material template, and right here I've got this one called black camera, which I'm going to go ahead and apply it, and I'll apply it to my entire scene because I only have one model in here. And right away my camera changes and it looks pretty sweet. Although we can actually do better than this because our camera looks cool. Sorry for that, there was a loud car in the background. Our camera looks pretty cool, but our environment is kind of lacking. So let's see what we can do about this. Now, maybe you guys design or render models and you use the same models over and over again or similar type. And instead of starting from scratch every time, you might want to use a startup scene that can give you a bit of a head start every time you start a new KeyShot session. So we're going to talk about this here in a second. So because my camera right here is looking kind of lonely on its own, I'm going to go ahead and go to my preferences. So that's going to be under KeyShot, preferences, edit preferences if you're on a PC. And we've got this default startup scene option. And I'm going to go ahead and search for a startup scene. And I'll go to my desktop and I'll choose my studio startup, hit open, and I'll hit save changes. One more time, I'm going to quit. If I launch KeyShot, what we'll notice is that I should have my startup scene by default. It's looking good. And if I then go ahead and import my camera and use my material template, now you can see where we're really starting to save ourselves some time. You know, if I am a company that manufactures cameras, they're all probably going to be close to the same size, all those models. So I can use a startup scene that has kind of a common basic size that I can work with. So we don't see anything yet. It's quite dark. Well, a couple things we can do about this. First off, my camera is inside this block right here. So I can go ahead and turn on my lights here so we can see this. And if I go and grab my camera, here we go, hit our hotkey to move it. I'll move it up and then hit snap to ground. Oops, snap to lower object is what I wanted. So it'll snap to this object here. And then if I were to move this guy right off to the side, maybe throw this in the corner to create an interesting composition here. Maybe rotate it a little bit. All right. So what I've done here, now we've got our camera. I could say maybe turn off my physical lights if I wanted to. So let's talk about this startup scene. What we're looking at here is basically a few planes with a block that I've got, I call it a pedestal, that the object or our model is sitting on. And if we go ahead and check out what else we have going on here, if we look, we have camera saved. So we've got a camera that's a left 3/4 close up with depth of field. We've got a front view, which just shows a front view of the entire scene. Then we have a close up. It's kind of a right 3/4 close up. And what's interesting about all this is I also have studios. So if I open my studios can allow me to switch between, say, a white studio with HDRI, which means I've got a white backdrop, a white ground, and this block of marble for my product to sit on. And then an HDRI means it's not lit with physical lights. And then if I go to my black studio HDRI, looks like it's not all changing for whatever reason. There we go. It was lagging. So this is my all blacked out scene. So I could switch potentially to, say, a different camera here if I used my drop down. Or I could just go to a free camera. There we go. And then, of course, I've got my black studio with IES lights as well. So ahead of time, my startup studio was created with a plane for the backdrop, a plane for the ground, and a block for my camera to sit on. And then my 6 IES lights. And what's cool, though, is I could even go into those IES lights, into my physical lights here. I could turn them on and off like a light switch by toggling the model set, because they're in their own model set. And what's even cooler is I can go in and edit the materials. There are actually multi-materials, so I can switch between neutral, a warm light, and a cool light. So all in my pre-built studio, I've got all these options that I can toggle between. There's lots of time-saving stuff that I can do with all this, which is really quite neat. And again, I'll go back to my all-white studio because it's probably a little easier to see there. All right, so lots of crazy stuff there. I notice we're getting toward the end, so I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit. We've got some material stuff to look at. We talked about material templates. We can search for materials. That's just as simple as searching for the material you want. So if I want a red, shiny plastic, I can use keywords and I can search through my entire material library, regardless of what folder I'm in, to find the exact material I need. I can also select by material, which is pretty great. So moving back, I'm going to go ahead and close my Studios panel. If I went into my scene and looked at my in-scene materials, let's say I wanted to select the item with the gold material applied to it, but I don't know where it's at. Well, I can click it in this list, right click, and say, select parts with material. And we see the little orange outline. What that's going to do is show us exactly in our scene where those where that gold was applied. And it looks like it's on the contacts here inside this little USB-C reader. So you can always choose a material in your scene, right click, select parts with material. Sorry, sometimes my eyes fail me. So there we go. We've got our rings on our lens. And it can just be a fast way to quickly identify what material is what and where it is within your scene. Another thing that we have is multi-materials. So we kind of hinted at this. We don't quite have time to go through this, but we've covered this on some previous webinars and we can link those up if needed. But the whole idea of a multi-material is the fact that I've built this studio with the backdrop. I don't want to create a new one every single time I want a different variation. So I went ahead and used multi-materials to give me options for different parts. And I can switch between these different materials whenever I want in order to save myself the time from going back and forth and making a bunch of copies of the same scene essentially. So another thing here, I'm going to show you in the material graph, there's a couple things you can do really quickly. So if we went into our material graph, let's say I look at the textured grip material for this camera. If I look at the material graph, we can see it's pretty simple here. And one thing is in our material graph, we can actually have our materials and textures showing. And we can use our materials and texture browser here, but that can take longer than it needs to. So one thing I recommend doing is just always getting used to doing a right click here, and then you can access all your procedural textures, all the different material types, your animation types, utilities, etc., just from a right click within here. Another nice little trick here is adding a connector. You can add a node now to a string. So for instance, if I wanted to add a bump add, I can do this, and now I don't need to deselect or disconnect one of those to add a second node. I can always just click, right click, utilities, and then add if I need to. And the other interesting thing is KeyShot will actually only give you the options that are available. Since this is going into the bump channel, I only can add a bump add. And then also the one thing I'll mention is if you set the scale of a texture, let's say we have a couple of image textures. Let's go ahead and drag this in here and I don't know, this in here. Sometimes if we were to plug this into here and then we were to set our scale for this texture, and then we grabbed another texture and plugged it in, their actual scale or size might be off. However, if we, so let me say that again. If we have a bunch of textures connected here, and I went in and I wanted to start scaling textures, I could do so, but I'd have to go and do them one at a time, as opposed to if you start with just a single texture connected and we set its scale at the very beginning, then the textures we add will be synced and scaled relative to that first one. So that can be something that may save you guys some time. All right, we also have some cameras items. And right here, one thing that I'll call out is that when I am working with cameras, what I like to do, so let's say we have a camera, this is going to, let's call this our hero shot. And let's say we're happy with this camera. We don't necessarily want to get rid of it, but I'm exploring the option of maybe a secondary image. And maybe I want this to be my second camera. Well, notice that the hero one is unsaved. Well, if I go ahead and make a new camera, it will save my current position. That's what the new camera gets. So maybe this is supporting image. Now the hero camera is still where we left it because we never actually saved or did anything to override that camera. So when I'm looking around for a new angle, I will always leave it on the camera that I want to keep, and I'm just exploring. And then if I like what I see, I'll save off a new camera instead of going and doing it the other way around, which is creating a camera first, not knowing if you're going to use it or not. And in this circumstance, sometimes if you do this, you might end up with, oh, I don't want that camera. Then you have to go and delete it, or maybe you even forget what it was for, and then you've got extra cameras in your scene. So small distinction, but it can be helpful. Another thing real quickly here is we have our standard views script. And this one's an interesting one. If we go ahead and were to create, if we wanted to run a script to run a front, left, top, bottom, right, back camera view, we can do that by going into our scripts. And if we went into our window and found our scripting console, we have this create standard views script. And if we were to run it, it will create all these different cameras. Now the warning here, or the thing that I'll tell you up front, is that it's going to basically make sure that the biggest item in your scene is scaled to fit. So in this case, it will prevent, it's not going to be zoomed in on the camera. It's going to include my entire studio. So as I mentioned before, if we wanted our standard views script to not get in the way or not auto fit our scene based on the size of this geometry, we can make sure our studio here was in its own model set, separate than from the camera. So maybe I would take my product and move my product into a new model set like we did earlier. And then I could run that script and it would generate the standard views without being encumbered by the size of the backdrop and everything. And then just in the interest of time, I'm going to move past some of these things real quick. We had a quick tip last week that shows you very, very quickly how to create what used to be called view sets. And you can essentially do that using this button here that creates a camera and environment studio. Same with the environments. We can do that from within our environment tab. So make sure you watch that quick tip. It's only like 2 minutes long. It'll take you through that process. And that was published last week. And moving into animation, I'm going to mention really quickly. If we were looking at our scene tree, if I wanted to create an animation, we could go through our animation wizard down here, choose all of our options, etc. But if we don't like that, or if we want to work faster, we can always choose an object, right click on it, go to animation, and there we can go ahead and animate that however we wish to actually animate it. It will be added as a default animation. And then we have the properties on the right-hand side here, and we can go ahead and make all of those changes as needed. Same goes for cameras. In your scene tree, we can go to our cameras, and I could right-click and do a camera animation with any one of those if we needed to. Using copy and pasting linked animation, so I can always copy this animation and then choose another part and go to animation and paste linked. And what it will do is it will actually double up those animations. So using one animation, because I'm using assemblies here, I can have parts, one of these parts is undergoing 2 of the same identical rotations, whereas one of them is only undergoing a single rotation. So that I should mention keeps our timeline nice and cleared from clutter if you have a lot of parts doing the same animation as well. We mentioned the geometry view. There's a couple things in the animation preview here. When you run an animation preview, this will render out a preview, and in this case it will give us a simple preview of our animation, which I actually don't want to do right now. But we can use the gear icon right here to make changes to the settings that the render preview, animation preview gives you. So if you need it to go faster, you can reduce the number of samples per frame, and that will speed things along. The other thing is, before you actually go and do a big final animation test, render out your final animation, some animations can take a long time to render. So instead of being surprised by a mistake you made at the end of a big long render session, I would recommend that you do one of 2 things. One, you can drop your frames per second. Let's say I can type in 1. See if I can type in 1. And now I've got 1 frame per second. And if I had a 10-second animation, it would render out 1 frame every 10 seconds. And I could take a look at those frames to see if they look good instead of rendering at the default of maybe 30 that I might want to use. And that way, in a few minutes, I can get an idea of how nice each one of those frames will look. Alternatively, if you have a very long animation, maybe you would prefer to just test some of those key frames, meaning choose along your animation timeline a couple different frames or a few parts along the line, just render those frames out and make sure they look good before committing to a big full animation rendering. All right, so I apologize, guys, because that went a bit longer than I had expected. I underestimated how much content I wanted to share with you. So hopefully those of you who stuck around found it to be helpful and you learned quite a bit from this process. Sorry for going over for any of those who had to leave. I'm going to go ahead and ask Rex and Josh if we have any time to take any questions. And if we do, I'll be more than happy to answer some. But if we do not have time to answer any questions today, we'll have to move on, close out this video, and you guys will need to comment on the YouTube video of this recording when we publish it. So thank you so much for your guys' time today, and I hope you have a good day, and happy shooting, happy rendering. There you go.
All right, thanks, Will. Yeah, lots of great little tips there. We still have over 80 attendees, so I don't see any reason not to go ahead and answer some questions.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome.
Yeah, the first one I see is from Isabel. When you asked what are the things that people spend the most time on, she mentioned she has some trouble with finding the right resolution and aspect ratio. Maybe you can just show us how to create a custom aspect ratio or a custom resolution preset. I find that to be pretty useful when working in something that's not a standard format.
Okay, cool. So first off, the one thing that I will mention as far as adjusting aspect ratios and resolutions is, so you've got a couple places you can adjust this. You can do this in the image tab. And if I want this to be 1000 pixels wide, I can type that in, and then I can go ahead and type in the width. Maybe I want, or sorry, the height. Maybe I want this to be 500. And so that's kind of a 1:2 wide aspect ratio. Now, my aspect ratio here was unlocked because the chain links were gray, not blue. So when they're not blue, you can make those adjustments. Now, if I were to say make this 900, it's going to automatically scale down. Oops, sorry. Let's try that again. If I make one of those a change to one of these fields when these are blue, it will adjust both of those together. So make sure, one, that you know the difference between a locked and unlocked aspect ratio. The other thing here is, of course, we've got custom. And in my case, this is empty, but let's say this is my ideal aspect ratio. I can go ahead and edit custom and go ahead and create a new one and call this my aspect ratio. Go ahead and hit OK, and then we've got one of them saved. So that's 800 by 600. Now, as far as editing those, I can just double click to type in a different size. So if I want this to be 1000, I can set that at 1000 and then set this one wherever I want. So you can go ahead and continue to do this to dial in the aspect ratios that you need or want. The other way, if you don't want to move on over this image tab, the way that I personally end up changing these is I use the image drop-down menu up here quite often. And almost always what I'll do is I'll start off with setting my actual aspect ratio, because if I know this is going to be for maybe a print, I can choose that size. Or if I know it's going to be a 1920 by 1080 or whatever image, I can choose that. Oh, that's too big for my screen. So rather than do that, I will always go down to choose a aspect ratio, 16 by 9. And then you'll see that this lock aspect is checked. I want to uncheck that. Actually, sorry, we want lock aspect checked on. We do not want lock resolution on. So now if I resize my window, it will allow me to adjust this while preserving that aspect ratio. If we want to maintain that resolution, we make sure we lock the resolution. And now I can't scrunch it down any smaller, and it won't scale up any bigger, but it maintains that 16 by 9 ratio. The last thing I'll add, because it sounds like there's a lot here, but the last thing I'll add is that when we go to do our final rendering, the actual size of our image that our final offline render will be is 100% controlled by the aspect ratio that we've defined here or here. So if we want to render out a square image when we're done, we need to make sure that we go and change in our real-time view to have a 1:1 ratio. And then when we go to render, we can have a 1:1 aspect ratio. Hopefully that's thorough enough.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we have another question about finding the coordinates and the position of one model so that you can position another model relative to that. Or perhaps you have a model change that you want to import and position into the same position as another model. Maybe you can show us selecting an object in the scene tree, showing the position of it, and how to copy and paste the position of one object to another.
Yeah, so let's go ahead, and if I add let's see, so we've got our camera here. And let's say we've imported another part. I mean, I suppose I can just bring in another one of these models, and I can go to my scene. It's going to add this to our current scene. And what we can do is, as Rex mentioned, is choose the camera that's already in our scene from the scene tree, find out its location, and then use that as information. And there's one little trick that I might be able to show you guys that helps with this. So our new model is now buried as it was before in the middle of our scene. So if I wanted to, I can go ahead and take the first model, the first camera, and look at its position subtab underneath the scene tree, and we see its location, its coordinates. You know, the way we would normally do this back in the day was take down these coordinates and then just copy and paste them onto the other camera. But right now, what we should be able to do is grab the location of our current camera, click on the new camera, and hit paste position, and we see that they're now lined up. One was stacked on top of the other. And that took a lot of either guesswork or painful kind of data entry of coordinates into from one into the other. So if for some reason that paste position didn't work, another thing I could have done was like copy each one of these and then type those values into the other object.
That's a really great tip. We also had a question about size and measuring objects inside of KeyShot, if there's any way to do that. So if you don't mind just clicking the Properties tab and showing that there are some size parameters there under the Group option, so you can see exactly what the size of that object is. If you're importing another model that was created with different units, perhaps you can make sure that those line up. There was also another little tip that came about in the question section, and that was if it's possible to mirror an object in KeyShot. So this is one of those hidden features that many people don't realize is there, but maybe you can just quickly show us how to do that.
You might have to remind me, is it using the opposite coordinates here?
So you'll put in a -1 into the scale field of the direction that you want to go in.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So if you want to mirror that across the y-axis, then you would put a value of -1 in the scale.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, totally got you. Let's go ahead and grab this guy. -1 here. And there you go. You're right. So the vertical axis, this camera is now flipped around its vertical axis. That's a nice one. That's cool.
All right. Another thing that came about while you were showing the cameras is the option to duplicate a camera, which I find very helpful if you have camera animations included with your camera. So you can actually right-click in the camera list, select duplicate, and that will include animations that were added with that camera, so you don't have to re-add those.
That's very good. Yeah, I like that.
Okay, we had another question or a comment. Let's see. Here we go. Ben was having trouble consolidating materials that he imports on models that he imports. He said these are coming in as a step file. So I'm assuming that those are probably all linked materials as one part or one material. And he's probably unlinking all of those so they become independent materials, and it becomes very cumbersome to then link those. And there's actually a number of different things we can do to help speed up that process. And you know, I think something that's overlooked a lot is dragging and dropping materials onto a multi-selection of objects in the scene tree.
Sure. Yeah,
So when you have, yeah, go ahead.
that's fine. I'm going to turn off those so we can see this camera that doesn't have anything. So let's say we had a couple groups and I wanted them to receive this red plastic. We can do that. And in doing that, there's, I don't know how many parts, but there's probably 20 or some odd parts that I just applied that single material to. What else do you have, Rex? I know there's a few more in there.
Yeah, you can also use the isolate materials to selection function. So let's say you wanted to, multi-select in your in-project materials list.
Mm-hmm.
You could take a number of those, select parts by material, and then isolate materials to selection.
That's
that'd be in the material flyout.
Up here? No. Sorry. In the real-time view. Sorry. There we go. Yep. And that doesn't help that I have a bunch of stuff that's turned off right now. So I'll turn all those on.
Yeah, what that's going to do is it's going to link all those materials into one.
Yep. And if I had my something like this, should be this guy here. Yeah, sorry about that. My scene's a mess right now. But nonetheless, yes, what we can do, as you mentioned, is basically you can use a combination of our in-scene materials list. You can, if you want all these parts to become the same, because like Rex mentioned, you might have a model with hundreds or even thousands of parts that all have the copy of the exact same color or material. You can drag a material on. So now these are all duplicates. That maybe is what you had. You can select all of those, right click, link materials, so those become one shared material. And if I were to do, let's say I want all these green parts to become red, if I select the red one first and hold Control to multi-select those, right click, link materials, they all become red. So that first thing that you select is what everything else is going to take on appearance-wise. The other one that Rex had mentioned was the isolate materials to selection. So that's going to link a whole bunch of parts. If we had, so I have a bunch of red ones here that are all the same. Let's say I want just these 3 red ones to be linked together and separate from the rest of these other red ones. I could right click, say material, isolate materials to selection. Now, if those get a different color, they're linked to each other, but also the red ones that they were part of are still linked to each other as well. So that, as well as using things like we mentioned earlier, breaking out groups or parts into model sets and filtering and searching within your scene tree. I mean, there's lots of ways to approach that problem. And sometimes it just takes kind of a holistic approach to think of the fastest way to get that accomplished. But it's a good question for sure.
Yeah, and another helpful tool is the filter of the in-project materials list.
Totally. So we can filter by model set or by visibility. Of course, everything is now turned on and everything is in one model set. However, well, if I turn on my physical lights, which are very, very bright at the moment, if I were to look at my materials, now we see our light material, and I could say filter by model set. And now there's only, as I turn the model sets on and off, our list changes. So yeah, lots of good suggestions there.
Cool, well, it's pretty late. I think we can go ahead and wrap it up.
Cool. Well, thank you for taking those questions, Rex. And thanks everybody who took the time to watch, everyone who stuck around and asked questions. Hopefully this has been helpful. For more webinars and quick tips and other learning content, you can go to youtube.com/KeyShot3D. And before you guys leave, make sure you take time to check out the KeyShot Render World website. And I hope to see you there.